Since the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library and the Gospel of Judas, and them being made readily available and translated into English, or translated English and readily available to read, uh, we have now have a much broader view of early Christianity, and it was a lot more diverse than we've ever thought. At least that's what we hear on documentaries, these popularist documentaries. And I hear people repeat this. And I the people repeating this, I think that's just what it is they're just repeating this, because if you look at the 27 book canon that the West has, and I know certain people were raised to believe that this was dropped from heaven like the Quran. Well, I was raised on the Quran, so when I read the New Testament, I had plenty of doubt in it. And what became immediately clear to me is that the four Gospels came out of four different groups of Christians. I mean, unless you're reading it as the most blindest faith, you can see this. You can see a progression, too, you can easily tell what's earlier and what's later. I mean, it smacks you in the face. Going on to look at things that are just outside of the New Testament, or maybe probably should have been added in, like the Epistle of Barnabas, the Didache, and the writers within the first century, and just over the line of 100 AD, or AD 100, into the second century, like Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, and then going on to Polycarp, Irenaeus of Lyon, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria, and even the knowledge that we have of Tatian's Diatessaron and the Moratorian fragment. We see that you have Marcionism and Gnosticism and Judaizers. Right there, even within the New Testament, you see Docetism being fought and Judaizers being fought. So there's already factions, even with the first thing written, which possibly is Galatians. Galatians is at least one of the earliest, if not the earliest. You already have a faction. You already have Judaizers and Paul. And you have, in the book of Acts, what do you have? You have disagreements between James and Paul. You have a group of followers of John the Baptist who don't know about Jesus. In the Apocalypse of John, you have these Nicolaitans. In the pastoral epistles, you have, well, not even the pastoral epistles, yeah, they're talking about those who, deny marriage. But even before that, in the undisputed works of Paul, you have those saying, "Oh, I'm from Apollos," or "I'm from Paul," or "I'm from Barnabas." The works of John, the Johannine epistles, John 1, 2, and 3, we see them heavily trying to combat Docetism. Matthew is a very Judaized God. It's taking Mark and Judaizing the hell out of it. And an extra thing called the other source, or quell, or Q. We see then the writer of Luke taking Q and Mark and going the other way with it, trying to, I guess, the logical progression of Mark, where it's not anti-Gentile in any way or pro-Jew. Then, as I mentioned, the other guys, these guys that get called the early church fathers, although not all of them are the church fathers, certainly not Origen or Tertullian, they quote from books that get contained in the 27 canon. From Paul, from these various Gospels. And because Marcion had taken Luke and edited it and edited the works of Paul and made his own little canon, there was a reaction against that, saying, well, we gotta, if the heretics are already doing this, we need to get something together to say this is what it is. These are affirmed. And we see this almost simultaneously happening in different parts of the world. We have Irenaeus of Lyon writing about 4 Gospels. We have Tatian on the other side of the world in Syria. Irenaeus was in what would be modern-day southern France. Tatian is in Syria. And the Moratorian fragment, I believe, was found in Italy. Could be Egypt. My memory was not serving me correctly on that one. But they affirm the 4 Gospels. And these are quoted by the earliest writers. When Gnosticism and Marcionism are talked about in Tertullian, who's a mean jerk, but great rhetorist, and in Irenaeus, who's a lot more compassionate and actually defends the Quarter-Medicians, it's more bizarre and more varied, and a lot of times they get accused of abolishing the nuptial bonds and having, all this, being drunkards and having all these sex parties and everything. What do we find in the Nag Hammadi? Well, the Gnosticism that we now call Gnosticism, the abolishment of the idea that sex is wrong, it's evil, it's part of the creation of the demiurge. And why is sex horrid? Because, well, it's a carnal act. It's the most carnal thing you can do. You're not really being, in the eyes of the Gnostic, not really being spiritual. You're just, it's an animal urge, right? I don't know if anybody can deny that. Although us then in the Eastern Church actually see it as something almost supernatural in the family, as having almost a supernatural component, that family and sex are good. The Gnostics went the other way, because not only was it an extreme carnal act, it perpetuated the cycle of sex, birth, sex, death. This is what kept going on, as well as pulling souls out of the pleroma and entombing them in bodies. And now you have to care for, these screaming, crying babies that you have to teach and everything. And the Gnostics were these celibate men. They valued celibacy and maleness, or in other cases, androgyny. The Gospel of Thomas, or the sayings of Thomas, is, Mary Magdalene is told that she will be saved because Christ will make her male. We see this in the Gospel of Mary as well. The more varied writings don't come from the Gnostics. They actually come from non-canonical or even heretical Gospels that were kept around by who? The Eastern Church. The West may have not known these existed, but they were found in monasteries. The Acts of Paul were always known about. The Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Protevangelium of James, and to my shock, the Protevangelium. I thought the Protevangelium of James was something around the 3rd, 4th century. Well, there's a fragment of it dating to the early 2nd century. That's 100 and something for people out there that don't know. I think 2nd century means 200s. No, the 100s. So then I think the Nag Hammadi library and the Gospel of Judas burst the bubble. Actually show that the Gnostics were probably more orthodox in many ways than they get portrayed. Because let's face it, Tertullian was a rhetorician. He was arguing against this stuff. Irenaeus, I don't doubt that those who despise the material world and think that the material world's wrong could go either way: celibacy and harsh asceticism, or saying, well, since this physical world is evil and salvation is through secret knowledge, then nothing we do in the flesh can be sinful. So they drink and have a lot of sex. We see this in Hinduism. It splits both ways. In certain forms of Hinduism, at least, it does split both ways. That when you introduce Docetism, where the physical and the spiritual cannot be in union, they always have to be in opposition. That you get either the ascetic celibacy that we see in the Nag Hammadi, or you get the drunken, sex-crazed maniac. We saw this. I mean, when I say we, I mean us looking back at history. We saw the same thing in England. You had the Puritans and those groups, and eventually the Shakers under Anne Miller. But then you had ranters, and you had the Oneida group. I mean, it's continually, whenever it, and I think that's actually what Calvinism is a resurgence of Valentinianism. Just as Martin Luther, it's a resurgence of Marcionism. So of this, we didn't know Christianity was so diverse. Well, if we take a very critical, skeptic view of the New Testament is a compilation of works of the Valentinians, the Marcionites, the Cerinthians, and the Judaizers, as well as possible some Catholic writings in there, although if you're really skeptical, you don't think there was Catholic. You think it was the Catholic was just a word that everybody used, and it winded up being this composite of the 27 books was the most varied works you could possibly find. I mean, really, look at it. It's mind-boggling, actually, that you would have this 27 canon, and who narrowed down this 27 canon and said these are the only things to be read. Well, nobody, actually. It wasn't even Ignatius or Athanasius of Alexandria in his 39th Paschal letter. He didn't, in the East, only to be read means in church. We still don't read the Apocalypse of John in service. Why not? Because we didn't know about it. The Pope of Rome pushed it through. We never had it. Many of our churches didn't have 2nd Peter, or 2nd and 3rd John, or Jude. And what do we find out today? Modern scholars say, yeah, those are later. Luther had the right attitude when he said, hey, look at Jude, Hebrews, James, and Apocalypse. I'm going to put as anti-legomena. But of the of establishing a canon or being elitists or cutting people off, that was the Marcionites and the Gnostics. I mean, the Gnostics were the celibate men who salvation wasn't for all. It wasn't for the woman and the slave and the child. It was for the very few. And as for this idea of Caesaropapism, or the empire using, politicizing Christianity, yeah, they may have done that after Theodosius, but John Chrysostom got exiled 7 times. He called the empress a whore to her face. He died in exile. The defenders of icons, I mean, it was the women, it was the empresses who defended icons, and it was about a 300-year struggle. The idea that the Pope of Rome ruled Rome was a backwater until just before the Crusades. I mean, people think, oh, the papacy. I mean, that's the reason why all the Eastern churches, there were 5 C's. The East, when they said, yeah, we're not gonna, the Latin West under the Pope of Rome has been introducing a lot of new stuff, changing things, taking things out, and declaring himself bishop of all the world, and that he's bishop of all bishops, which we know is a pagan title. Yeah, he's not the leader of us. I mean, even going back, we see it. The early writers, just even after Nicaea, talk about the Donatists, the Novatians, the Circumcilians, it's much more diverse. Well, I should say it always has been much more diverse. And the Nag Hammadi is pretty anticlimactic, as is the Gospel of Judas. I mean, for the longest time, the critical historian said, "Oh, Irenaeus is just a slanderer. He made up this Gospel of Judas. There's no such thing." Well, we found it. I mean, some people want to say Clement of Rome and the Shepherd of Hermas were Cerinthian Judaizers, and Polycarp was a Marcionite. Well, that makes the Catholic does not. I don't mean Roman modern papal Latin Roman Catholic when I'm talking about Catholic now, or actually even before. But if you're taking a skeptical view, then Catholicism is the mix of the most divergent forms of Christianity possible. Cerinthianism and Marcionism, the Ebionite Cerinthian Gospel of Matthew alongside this idea of the Logos in John. Not to mention you have the Luke and Paul. You have Galatians and Matthew in the same book. You have Jude and 1 John. I mean, Paul even says, don't mind about genealogies, they're just foolish. And then you have two Gospels with genealogies in them. You have Jesus Christ saying, my kingdom is not of this earth. And then you got the Apocalypse of John talking about how Christ is going to have a kingdom on his earth. Or, I actually don't think he says that, because it's just a book of signs and symbols. But of divergent views, it's only the most blind that look at the New Testament and say, oh yeah, there's this one form of Christianity. There's 27 books in there, and the reason why the 4 Gospels get codified as 4 is not some conspiracy. It's because it was the thorn in the side of conspiracy. They were all from extremely early times, and you couldn't deny that, they were. So they had to accept the 4. Don't you think if the empire had anything to do with this, or the Bishop of Rome, who had no power, and actually there was no bishop in Rome, no one bishop in Rome for the longest time. I mean, if you look at any of the early church writings, there's a council of elders in Rome, and then when the Bishop of Rome comes around, even 1,000 years after the start of Christianity, you have the Bishop of Rome being criticized. Even before the Constantinian era, we have Tertullian, Irenaeus, Cyprian telling the Pope of Rome to go to hell. Even before he was called Pope. Yeah, it just blows my mind when people say, oh yeah, we have much clearer view, or it shows much more of a multiplicity than we've ever thought. No, it's always been known. It's just those who take the time to actually read documents instead of watching a documentary that, Elaine Pagels and Marvin Myers and John Dominic Carson are on talking. And it's funny, they'll have those people on, then they'll have like a Ted Haggard or a Benny Hinn. Those people aren't scholars. At least John Dominic Carson and Marvin Myers and Elaine Pagels had to learn something. Benny Hinn and Ted Haggard just need to lie. I mean, that's what they do for a living. But this idea of, well, you now know there's a multiplicity of Christianities out there. It's not added a single thing, and actually it's been anticlimactic. We've always known there's been this great multitude of Christianities out there that are just weird. The Coloridians. They believe Mary was a part of the Trinity. The weirdest stuff is not Gnostic. It's quote-unquote Orthodox or Catholic, but it's just too weird to have in the New Testament, or too late. Proto-Evangelion, the infancy of Thomas. And some of the stuff, it's arguable whether it is Gnostic or not. I mean, Gnostic was a label thrown on the enemies. There's know-it-alls, but they did have secret knowledge, and they were A lot of them were exclusively male or hated sex. That's my thing. It's my video, and if anybody wants to challenge me on it, not just swear in the comment section, I'd love to have a conversation. Because where has there been any new dimensions to ancient Christianity added since the discovery of the Nag Library? They really haven't broadened our perspective. If anything, it narrowed it to say it's less diverse. It's not as different as these rhetoricians made it out to be.